All right, everyone, if we could have those who are still in the lobby area come on inside. We have our last our last panel for today. Make sure he's good in the back. Because they're recording us live, so he wants to. Okay. All right, so we have our last panel for today. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there with us. It has been an awesome day. I have had so much fun. I was scared before I came because I already knew, you know, like all the crazy stuff that happens in security. I'm now more afraid than ever. And then this panel is going to kind of take us home and really scare the crap out of us and remind us what we should be doing within our organizations and how we should continue this conversation after today. So I'm not going to introduce everyone. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. Just 2 minutes, each person, who you are, where you're from, and the best security advice. If you had one thing to tell everyone, what would it be? Go ahead, Dov.
So my name is Dov Uran. I'm with Cisco Security. So I lead the team that works on all of our strategic security technology partnerships and integrations. A lot of the world I live in today is around kind of building bridges and making sure technologies work together in the enterprise environment. I came to Cisco 3 years ago through acquisition, where we were working on malware analysis and threat intelligence. For me, I think the most important thing is clearly integration, and then as part of that is automation. So being able to react faster, making sure your technologies are working together, making sure that you're practicing intrusions as they're coming into your environment, and making sure it's, you know, it's a team sport, that everyone from the board level on down to the operator understands their role and what to do when these kinds of incidents occur. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect, Dov. Thanks for coming. Candace.
Candace Worley with McAfee. I've been there about 17 years. I'm from Portland, Oregon. And I'm going to throw out one of the most rudimentary things possible, and that is patch quickly. Mm-hmm. Like, seriously, how many of the breaches that we've seen recently have simply been because someone didn't get their systems patched? So although that's like old school and it's been around for a long time, it's amazing that we're still having to say it. Patch rapidly, because they will hack rapidly once that vulnerability is discovered and announced.
Thanks, Candace. That is our theme for today. It's kind of, you know, one of the things we've been talking about a lot is the basics. You know, we forget the basics sometimes. Serge.
So I'm Sergio Caltagirone. Most people call me Serge. Let's see, I was DoD, Microsoft, a whole bunch of IT stuff. I do industrial security now for Dragos. And one piece of advice I have is be proactive about your security. If your primary security directive is monitoring and waiting and planning, you've lost already. So you have to be a lot more aggressive than that.
Great advice, Serge. Always great advice. Dr. Steve.
Steve Hoover. I'm Chief Technology Officer for Xerox, and I'm not going to change my answer even though Candace said it. Stay current. Stay current. Technology, we heard it too from Kevin, right, and with patches.
Thank you, Dr. Steve. And then Urson, I mean, I'm always in awe of all of the great things we do at Park, so introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Ersin Uzun. I manage one of the labs at Park, and we do research on security and overall computer systems. So we talked about some of you know, what we're doing, what's inspiring us, so we're working on those. My advice is I'm not going to repeat what's you know, other panelists said, which are all important, but educate your people about security. In many of those cases, actually the weakest link is still the human in the loop, and you know, you basically get your way into the system through the humans, and after that, it's usually all you can eat buffet, because again, it's the perimeter security. Once you're in there, you know, there's very little that can stop.
So we're just coming off the heels. Thank you, Urson. We are just coming off the heels of a great lunch. We saw a lot. I know I was in awe of some of the things that I've seen. Some of them I've seen before, some of the things I hadn't seen. And though we know just by, essence of us being security people and technologists that we're kind of preaching to the choir, but, you have to have a defense in depth mentality is what you have to have, right? It has to be more than just one layer. And one of the things that he showed us, he had McAfee running and said, oh, it's got past McAfee. Candace, what do you think about that? How do you respond to that? And how do we include that now in our new infrastructures and ecosystem?
Well, I'm going to use the outside voice. And thank him for the opportunity to now talk about our products, right?
Right.
Because I think for most people who are in the security space, they understand fully that if what you're running is signature-based AV, you lost the battle. Signature-based AV will catch a lot of known threats. I talked earlier about the fact that we have 660 million samples in our malware database. We have signature capability to detect those samples. But every day, hackers and malware writers are creating new exploits, new malware. And unless you have behavioral type technologies that are watching for specific characteristics, behaviors, et cetera, on the system, specific vulnerabilities being exploited, et cetera, they can get past signature-based AV. So you have to have a multi-layered approach on your endpoint, just like you have across your entire network. So in addition to signature-based AV, we've had host intrusion prevention, which is exploit detection, in our portfolio for years. We also have containment capability that will reside at the endpoint. So think sandboxing capability, behavioral and machine learning capabilities that are part of our endpoint suite, which have specific technology built into it to identify exploits and zero-day types of attacks. So although I think it made for great TV, if we were looking at signature-based AV being bypassed, I don't think that's a surprise to a lot of security experts.
But even if we were looking at signature-based AV as the only thing, right, as the only layer, you've already lost,
You've lost that battle, although in most organizations, and he did allude to this, you have web security at your web gateway, which if it's a URL that's involved and end users clicking on a URL, it's probably going to go through your web security, and there's going to be another layer of engine that's going to inspect at that level. If it's in IP traffic, if it's in network traffic, you probably have an intrusion prevention solution at the network edge that's going to inspect. And that's why it's so important to look at your security program from a holistic perspective, not an individual device type perspective. Okay, my endpoints are secure. Good for you. Because now somebody's going to come through your web gateway or your email server or your network edge. And so it's critical that you're looking at what do you have in place and how do all those pieces fit together? And so, thanks for the opportunity to address that. Yeah, I was having a little hyperventilating moment back in the room, as you can imagine. But I think any AV vendor that had been on the box would have been experiencing the same thing if you didn't have the more zero-day advanced protections in place.
Right, and so you wanted to mention?
Yeah, that just talks more to your point about defense in depth, where you can't just overly rely on one part of the technology spectrum. And the ability to monitor and continuously monitor the behaviors of activity in your environment, on your endpoint, your users, your user behaviors, your customer behaviors. All those things are part of the additive sum that go into your security program. And being able to take that information and blend it across various products and services and solution providers that you're employing is part of that defense in depth strategy.
Like if we talked about what we do with Xerox, we leverage the whitelisting capability,
That's
right?
right.
The ability to essentially say if this executable is not whitelisted, it can't execute on the box. Had that been in place, we wouldn't have seen what we saw, right? So
we also digitally sign, right?
Right.
Digitally sign our
So that multi-level, multi-layer approach is critical.
Steve, you want to add? You have anything you want to add to that as well?
Not really. I think they said it great.
Good. This is an open conversation. This is me talking to all of my friends. I've had several conversations with everyone that's sitting here on the panel. Feel free to join in on the conversation as well, okay? So if you have questions, just kind of nod at me or something. Well, if you just nod at me, then I might nod back. But, kind of raise your hand a little bit. Yes.
spend a lot of money with penetration tests and all this kind of stuff. So we should lock down more the OS. Is to be based just on the database antivirus definition. That is kind of obsolete. It was 20 years ago. So now that defense cannot be done in these days.
Right.
Like a ransomware. So why we just lock down the computer? Don't try to, every software what you run there, don't try to encrypt the files. Get 10 pop-ups for the user, so the end user, even home. So how you are protected inside to the company, you can have a proxy. So like the guy did before, who opened the connection outside. That actually that is not a virus. It's a software. Open the connection outside. If you have a proxy, you cannot do it. You have to go to.
You're right. So let me answer to that. There's two things I want to say to that. One is external partnerships is key. So we don't focus on, as he said, it's Microsoft, it's a lot of other vendors. But we are talking here about a solutions approach. It's about bringing all of us together. And if you are looking at your vendors as a vendor as a part of an ecosystem instead of as a part of an entire solution, and really the definition of an ecosystem is things that work together, right? If they don't have the synergy to kind of work together, that's number one where we fail. The other thing that we talk a lot about, Serge, you and I had a great conversation about the zero trust model. And that's what you were saying. Instead of, we could have, that ports could have been blocked, he could not have even had access to the internet, things like that. Serge, you want to talk a little bit about the zero trust model and how that plays a role in our future conversations?
Yeah, I think when you posit the hypothesis that all you need to do is lock down the OS, I think you're assuming a lot there. One, in that it's possible to lock down the OS. The OS is a very complicated beast. The other problem with that is that most vulnerabilities actually don't exist in the OS. They're at the application layer at the moment. So at that point, you've got a whole bunch of other software vendors involved, not just the OS vendors. So I think that conversation the idea that you're positing there is a little bit bigger than I think that question that you posed. But I think to get to your underlying point on that, it's that, so first of all, trust has to start at the hardware level. And this is really fundamentally about trust, right? What do you trust? Which users do you trust? Which software do you trust? Which applications do you trust? All this stuff. Do you trust the gentleman at the urinal next to you, right? This is all about trust. And so the question comes down to, I think that we have fundamentally misplaced our trust. Fundamentally misplaced our trust in our systems, in our users. And I think I'm not one to call users stupid. I really think that's a bad idea for everybody, right? And I think they're users. And they're trying to use the system the way it's designed and the way that we've given them the capability to use the system. And if we've given them an insecure ability to use the system, that's our fault, the system designers, not the user's fault. So what we need to do is I think we need to take the onus off of the users and honestly off of the system administrators in many cases who are challenged with locking down the systems effectively. I think we need to move to more of a zero trust enclave-based model where trust is earned, not given. And where you inherently distrust everything on your network. And that you should start with that. I mean, it used to be, God knows, it used to be just not rocket science to say deny all as the last thing on your firewall list. We all knew that, right? If you configure a firewall, your last rule shouldn't be permit anything. It should be deny everything except what's in your list. And yet, with our network architectures and our authentication and identities, we've basically done the opposite, which is allow everything except what we've denied. And I think that we've basically gotten bitten by that very, very badly.
Right. This really brings me to the thought of automation. Like you talk about removing, the users from the equation, removing systems administrators from the equation. Steve, how do we further move this conversation to automation and have that a value add?
Yeah. So I think. It's a really interesting challenge, the zero trust challenge. I think you're right. The problem is, right, the balancing of that and how we get the work done, right? And so I think automation is an interesting way to start to try to break that to break that conundrum, because can you learn over time what are the right uses of the system, right? So that you can trust them. Can you connect, as we heard today, connect different pieces of the security apparatus together to really get a better picture of whom to trust and whom not to trust. So I think it's a really interesting forefront.
Urson, I want you to add some color and flavor to that in terms of, the antibodies. I love that. I love that analogy of having an immune system. Yeah. And then while you do that, I want to go ahead and after that, we're going to go to the floor.
Sure. So, again, I think those are great points, but we also need to look where we are today, right? So we will not have all that, advanced systems that can learn and do things. So in the meantime, there will be, the period where even if we manage, which I hope we will, and which, we are working on, there will be a time that those systems will be deployed, and in the meantime, your users really need to be aware of their actions and how it can really affect the security. This zero trust is great, but I will give you a controversial example as well. So about more than 10 years ago now. I was working at one of the largest telecom equipment providers from Europe, and we actually tried this with a small group, right? So me and my group created a version of the Linux that everything that you execute needed to be signed, and all the ports that you're not using are closed, and it was a nightmare because suddenly all those people we're coming to our IT, office every hour, and the third day they were literally coming and shouting at us, right? So this is not working, that is not working, I cannot do that, right? So you need to understand that there is a trade-off that we need to give some flexibility, because as I said, in a cyber environment, it is really hard to predict what the next version of that software will be adding as a new functionality, and if you close that, then it will suddenly not run, and people get pissed, and it requires tremendous amount of in current systems human power to be able to stay ahead of that. So that's why we cannot afford. But with automated systems, we will get that capability, and we are seeing that in the intrusion detection systems. So you can say that they are the initial versions of those immune systems that we are seeing, but still they are learning very slow. They are learning very manually. We need to get it more automated.
Right. The way our bodies work, right? If something is injected in that's not supposed to be there, our bodies automatically try to push it out. That's how our immune system works. It's supposed to work, at least. And so that's the whole idea and premise behind this. And I think that is just such an outstanding way of kind of describing that. Let's go to the floor. Laura, you have someone with a question.
Yes, hi, my name is Ed. I have a question. We're talking about trust and zero trust. As we look at some of the other technologies that are emerging now, particularly blockchain type technologies, where trust is the primary area that is being addressed, where, as you're moving to this kind of model where you need to have authentication or consensus from various different vendors, that might be running their own products. Do you see an opportunity for blockchain type technologies or some of those aspects of blockchain in terms of being able to handle the automation as well as the ability to get some consensus, from folks in terms of a real-time model for saying, this is a threat and we have concurrence in those kinds of things, some of those basic fundamental principles of, the blockchain type of platforms?
I think we've seen some of that play out in other places, particularly in machine learning, where you'll run multiple models, each producing its independent confidence, in order to gain a consensus around a determination or classification. And we've learned that one model can't rule them all, and so I think that it's the same thing. It's the same thing here. I think it's being borne out in other domains, not necessarily security, but I agree that that's a good way to go. And I think that's kind of what, if we don't want to call it that, that's what defense/detection in depth is, right? It's like the attempt to blotch a whole bunch of different models together to see what works in a given scenario.
Good. We got another.
Could I add something to that?
Mm-hmm.
I think where blockchain could be interesting in security is really as it relates to authenticating the validity of a user or a system. So
we're like crowdsourcing our authentication almost.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about
integrity,
from say endpoint security perspective, one of the things that malware loves to do is spoof. Right? AV is on the system, AV is not on the system. I'm actually your AV. I mean, there's numerous ways they approach that. And so I know that there's been a little bit of research in our advanced labs teams around blockchain and how we may be able to leverage blockchain type technologies for validating that chain of trust associated with whether or not this is truly a legitimate piece of the software, the operating system, the application, et cetera. So I think over time, there could be some really interesting applications of blockchain as it relates to the security function. I just think those are still pretty early in the process. I think there's a few small companies that are leveraging it for security, but they're real nascent at this point. I do think it's actually kind of a little pet topic for me. I do think there's some really cool stuff that can be done over time.
Good. So another question from the floor.
Yes, my name is Lou Diaz with Vision E. My question is, as a practitioner in the space, we're seeing that 97% of the companies this year are expecting an IoT attack. 67% will suffer an IoT attack. And it's not necessarily directed at PHI or PII. So within this industry, our industry, what things do you think would be helpful in terms of mitigation and detection? Thank you.
I think you're key for that.
Dov?
Sure. I think similar to your initial thoughts, patching and staying up to date, having that relationship with the manufacturer to making sure they're understanding and they're taking security seriously. So signing up for updates and notifications on that. I think that's probably the most fundamental thing you can do is making sure your systems are up to date and sort of being vigilant as they're out there.
I think from a one thing that I've learned from the industrial space, which has some bad things to it, but honestly has learned a lot as well over the last 100 years in its engineering for critical infrastructure, has been that they are very good at engineering towards failure and towards attack scenarios. So power goes out actually all the time. People are so worried about malware taking down the power grid, not realizing that the power grid is actually very reliable. And they're very used to power going out. And that they've engineered the entire system to be highly reliable and resilient against attack in the end. And there are some, I would say, edge cases there. But I think that what we need to do is IoT is, what I would say is that IoT systems need to be equally resilient. If you're going to tell me that I got to patch 50 boxes in my house today, it's probably not going to happen, and it won't happen in the next decade. My router hopefully gets updated regularly, and on my edge, I don't even know how often Alexa gets patched, and so the question I think is that we need to assume vulnerable systems, not try to assume invulnerable systems. So I think it comes down to building a resilient system around it that, yeah, IoT is going to get attacked, and it's going to attack itself. My refrigerator is going to attack my toaster. Can my toaster survive? I don't know. I mean, my bagels I like, right? So let's, I want my toaster to survive.
But we're talking now about, you mentioned Alexa. Alexa was built to be connected. So that's one side of IoT. The other side of IoT are these devices that were built, and I'll just say a printer was not initially meant to connect to outside. It was meant to stay in the intranet, but not necessarily meant to connect outside. You think about cars. Cars weren't built to connect. And so when you think about it from that perspective, now we're trying to add security onto something that was not even meant with that thought in mind. How do you answer that, just from a CTO and a park perspective? How do you now look at the IoT space and kind of, now we don't want security toppled on, we do want it baked in, we do want it by design?
Yeah, so I think it's in those words, those three words that you said, Dr. J, secure by design. So it is the responsibility now of people who are making these devices to really take that approach. I mean, and that's an approach, and it was a change for us probably about a decade ago that we really took a very different approach from, oh, how do I add security on to build it in by design into it. All the developers trained in security best practices, finding the right set of partners like McAfee and like Cisco to work with, the right certifications to demonstrate. And so those people who have made those devices, as you say, that grew up in one world, right? They've got to be responsible and take security by design. I think there's an additional thing, and we've tried to live this out, and we talked about it in Urson's and my talk that ties to this idea of IoT, though, is there's an advantage here in that these devices generally have a narrow function and a set of behaviors that you want to do. That is, because back to this whole, it's easy to say, yeah, we don't trust anything and prove it to me, but then as Urson says, well, then for a general purpose computer, I can't do anything with it. But if it's a temperature sensor or a water pump or an MFD, which scans to email and prints and all that, and I've got Linux in there, but that's why we went to the whitelist technology. You know what? I don't want somebody, and you don't want me to let somebody just download whatever. We may have a Linux kernel on our machine, but that doesn't mean we should, open a Word doc and, and let it deposit code. We don't have to, because we're an IoT device. So there is some actual benefit that if people who are designing those systems really think about that you can really leverage that because the intended function is, is a narrower space.
Yeah. And
could I?
Boy, don't we know about that, right? So when Park invented, Ethernet and the networking protocols that we use today, the use case was connecting the computers, inside
Down
the building.
Yeah.
Behind a security perimeter. It was never meant to connect, computers over something like internet. And then now, after that, it basically, was used for that, and we are trying to bolt on the security on it, for the last 40 years, and we are still not there because it was not designed, with security in mind. And I want to give a little bit more deep insight. So what we mean by, modeling and how we use that. So in an IoT system, when you connect these hundreds of devices, the configuration space is combinatorially explosive, right? So, if you try to secure each device, without the context of the overall system, it doesn't mean that you secure the whole system. So we are actually creating software that can not only model these individual components in an IoT system, but also model the whole system. And it automatically injects attacks, failures, failures both in hardware and software, and gives the designer feedback. What might be those chain reactions that can result in? That's, searching that space as a human is not easy for us. But if you let a clustered computer run for a few days, it can actually go through all that scenarios and give you the feedback. Now you can improve your configuration as well as the design of the device. So that is part of what we are working on at Park right now.
Candace.
Yeah. So you said some of these devices have been built to be connected, and you're absolutely right. But that doesn't mean they've been built to be secure.
Right.
And so I think to your point, having the manufacturers begin to think about security at the architectural level becomes critical. And I think we can sit in this room all day and say, those doggone manufacturers, they should be building this stuff to be secure. And we'd be right, but that doesn't mean they'll do it. So I think as people who are worried about IoT devices in your network, it's kind of incumbent upon you to have those conversations with the vendors that you're buying from, making sure that they understand that you're paying attention to the security of these devices, that the security of those devices is critically important to you in your buying criteria, and that you're going to be asking them hard questions about how you secure that device, what they've built into it to ensure it's secure, et cetera. And I think the pressure needs to come from both ends, because we all know that if we just count on people to build the security straight in, they may or may not do that. So I just think it's worth adding. It needs to be asked on both sides. Vendors need to take responsibility for that, but I think it's going to be you guys as customers of those vendors. You're going to have to ask them hard questions, because at some point they're going to make an investment trade-off. Do I put security in, or do I put that other feature in I can charge $25 for? Well, $25 is going to win every time. until something happens that costs them $100 million. And I think if you guys press on them, ask those hard questions, that'll help move that ball forward.
In our experience, they do.
Good. I don't know that particular.
They ask us hard questions all the time.
I'm going to take one last question from the audience.
And that's good. Keeps us on our toes.
Hi, my name is Todd Hames. I'm at Orange Business Services. So we're in the business of providing connectivity to multinational organizations worldwide. So in my journey, I'm constantly speaking to CEOs, CIOs, CFOs, right, about the cost constraints that they're under in terms of where budget is moving as it squeezes the balloon between marketing and security and everything else. So now you see this proliferation towards internet first, cloud first, et cetera, because the budgets are squeezing. So again, what conversations are you guys having with CIOs, CFOs, and multinational organizations in terms of how they're making their budget decisions as they integrate as they integrate security into everything they're doing? You talked about reputational risk and how explosive that is, and it's an immeasurable amount. So I'm just curious to know what conversations are you all having in this particular space as you talk about these folks who have, organizations to run and numbers to meet for next quarter, et cetera, et cetera.
So I'll start that one out just from a CISO perspective and a CIO kind of mindset. We all buy products and a lot of it ends up being shelfware, right? And so the whole idea now is, and I'm not an advocate of selecting one vendor. This one vendor says, oh, I can do everything. I'm going to do be your web proxy, and I'm going to be your firewall. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm not, to that level. But I think we have to evaluate the products that we buy and find out kind of, what other things are they offering. So, you can buy a multifunction printer. You can buy a device that has lots of other capability, that has security embedded, that is easily integrated, And so all of those are key parts that you layer in and don't have to buy another solution for this, another solution for that. And that helps with that full budget decision. Dove, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think along those lines, a lot of the conversations we're having is just simplifying our operating environment. It's just too complex for the security operators and trying to get things to work together more. So if you have a SIM, making sure that all the different technology components are feeding into that, or if you have additional analysis tools on top of your SIM for specialized use cases. So time in and time out and conversation in, conversation out, that is probably the most pressing thing is how do my teams work? How can we, be more effective by managing our disparate systems here? And it's that simplification. And that's tough because it's a trade-off sometimes. You mentioned earlier in the trade-offs with the feature and the extra dollar, it's also on the security. Is it best of breed, or is it more of an architectural approach that you can provide different types of technologies that can fit into that framework? So sometimes getting it to work together is as much of an engineering challenge as a specialized feature.
Perfect. We've heard a lot today. We've shared a lot today. We have had such a good security conversation. As we wrap this thing up, one last question for each of you. You have 30 seconds to give me the answer, okay? Prevent, protect, detect. Which one is most important?
To me, well,
Dove, you started out.
Protection starts off as the biggest part of your block, but I think detect and react is going to increasingly become an important segment of learning from things that are coming through this block, this protect, because it's going to happen, whether it's AV, whether it's firewall, or whatever kind of system you have. There's humans touching the keys, and it's vulnerable software. There's just no way of stopping that. So I think getting smarter, quicker, faster at detecting and then reacting to those compromises is the name of the game.
Perfect. Candace.
Yeah, so I'm uncomfortable choosing, by the way. But as I sit here, in the 30 seconds I had to contemplate this, I think people have been doing protection for a long time. And I don't remember who said this, but a quote that sticks in my mind is that if you say that you haven't been hacked, you just don't realize you've been hacked yet, right? So it's unlikely that any organization has gone without some sort of breach. And so to that quote, and I subscribe to that quote because I think it's pretty true, I think detect is becoming increasingly more important. It doesn't mean that protect isn't important. It just means I think people have been doing that for so long that they're pretty decent at it now. I think detect, with the complexity and the sophistication of the attacks that we're seeing today, becomes critically important. And you know, the assumption is once you detect it, you're going to clean it up. So I think detect is probably where I would go.
Perfect. Serge.
Detection. And the answer is because blue teaming and red teaming is awesome, but humans suck at prediction. And so, honestly, good detection will tell you what you should be preventing in the future. And leading with detection, a detection-driven defense tends to provide more ROI than putting all your eggs into the basket and then watching it all disappear underneath you.
Perfect. Dr. Steve?
It is really mean to make us pick. But I'm strongly going to go with detect. Again, that provides the learning opportunity to even learn how to prevent, and it provides the opportunity to react. And if you kind of, in our talk, that was our point for the immune system. How do I detect? Then I can evolve and learn responses.
Urson?
What others said. So.
So the Xerox security value proposition is prevent, protect, detect, and external partnerships. Notice I didn't ask them to include external partnerships into that, because I think, and I think they all will agree with me, that external partnerships is definitely the #1 thing that's really, really important. Our external partnerships include you all. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed today. We're so glad that you were able to join us in this discussion. And then we hope to continue this discussion as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.